Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Utterly Remarkable Small Creatures Making a Big Impact, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Laura Geissinger. Thank you so much for being here today, Laura. Over to you.
Thank you, Brooke. And thank you all for joining us today. I would first like to take a moment, if my slide will change here, there we go, to introduce myself and my journey with sea otters. And so my background is in biology and environmental education, and I just recently finished getting my master's in environmental science with Oregon State University. And I did my master's research on sea otters, and I knew some about sea otters before I started that, but really that's when I learned that sea otters are an important part of our marine ecosystem, and they really may help us to better understand our changing oceans. And I have been guiding for nearly 20 years, and I live here in Alaska. And so my specific experience with sea otters has primarily been here in Alaska. And I've been guiding with NatHab for quite a few years now, and am a part of the Alaska trips and the canyon trips. And on our Alaska trips, it's possible to see sea otters on the Ultimate Alaska Adventure, the Grizzly Ship Adventure, and the Alaska Bear Camp trip. And for that one, you're mostly going to see your sea otters in Homer and not out at Bear Camp itself, although occasionally there have been sea otters spotted out on the coast there. So for my research for my master's thesis, I studied sea otters in lower eastern Cook Inlet in Alaska, which is on Kenai Peninsula. And during that time, I really began to understand the importance of sea otters, and that is what I would like to share with you today. So I'm going to start off sharing about my actual research for my thesis, and then we're going to go a bit bigger picture and talk more broadly about sea otters and the importance they have in our marine ecosystems. So I'm going to begin by doing a brief overview of my master's work. And so what I was doing was I was trying to determine, well, when I was trying to determine what I wanted to do for my master's project, I decided I didn't just want to do a project to get a degree, but I wanted to participate in work that was for a much larger cause than just myself. And so as I started to talk to different people around the state, I was encouraged to talk with the head of Fish and Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Homer, Alaska. And through conversations with him, we really started fleshing out like what are some needs of research in our state. And one of the things that he and I talked about was that there was a razor clam sport and personal use fishery in eastern Lower Cook Inlet that had been closed down a number of years ago in 2013. And people had been wondering what was behind the razor clam decline and the closure. And people were starting to see more sea otters. So people were saying, we can't get razor clams anymore because the sea otters have moved into the area and they're eating them all. And so the sea otters were getting blamed because people know that they do significantly shape their ecosystems and have caused declines to other species. For example, in Southeast Alaska, sea otters caused the decline of sea cucumbers, and that caused the closure of the sea cucumber fishery in that area. And so in Lower Cook Inlet, there was speculation that otters were to blame for the razor clam decline there too, but there was very little known about the sea otters in this region. And it was assumed that the sea otters were eating the razor clams because they've been noted to eat razor clams in other areas, but there had been no documentation to support that assumption in this area. And so there was very limited data from abundance surveys, and there was a few forage data collections from the very southern portion of my research study area. But other than that, no research had really been done on the sea otters in this area. And so because of that, I decided, as I would do my master's thesis, on studying the sea otters in this area and to see if I could help contribute to this understanding of what has caused the razor clam decline, and really are the sea otters to blame. And so what I was trying to do is I was trying to understand the sea otter usage in this area, between Clam Gulch, the north end, and Homer on the south end. And I was trying to determine if sea otters were actually eating razor clams. And if they were eating razor clams, what was their potential impact on the razor clams beds in lower eastern Cook Inlet? And so through my work, I worked with researchers at USGS, National Park Service, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and Alaska Department of Fish and Game to help support larger ongoing ecological studies that all of those agencies have going on. So just to give you a little bit of context, to show you where my research study was done, this here is Alaska. And my study was done here on the Kenai Peninsula. So this is the Kenai Peninsula here. And this is the very south end of Kenai Peninsula, and at Homer, and goes up here to Clam Gulch. So this was where my research study was, and Bear Camp is kind of across here. And then down here on my study is where Katmai is. So Katmai and Lake Clark are both across the bay, across Cook Inlet from my study area. So during my study, I was really focusing on two types of data collection. The first type of data collection I was doing was scan samples. And so for my scan samples, I had 6 selected locations, and I used a telescope to collect my data. And at each of these 6 sites, I would do a 2-hour scan, and for every 10 minutes for those 2 hours, I would just start scanning from the left of my site to the right of my site. And I would note how many adult sea otters were there and how many pups were there. And I would note what kind of behavior they were doing. I did scans at each site twice per month, one that started an hour before high tide and one that started an hour before low tide. And I did it in association with the tides because it would help give me an idea if the tides had any influence on the foraging behaviors. And then in July, there were far more sea otters present than I had seen during the other months. And so I did an additional 2 scans at random times of the day with those during at each site during July, just to see if the time of day had any factor as well. So because our tides change throughout the day, I kind of was comparing times and tides at each of these locations. And the behaviors that I was really looking for were resting, grooming, swimming, foraging, interacting, and hauling out. And so resting behavior is just where an otter is lying still on their back, and they put their forepaws out on their chest and their flippers up out of the water. And that's a very common behavior that you'll see. Grooming is something also that you see a lot of, and sea otters spend a lot of time grooming, and they're going to take their paws and they rub their fur, and they'll roll over and blow air into their fur, but they mostly just stick in one place while they're doing that. And then swimming is where they're obviously just swimming along the surface. Foraging is when they're feeding. And so when they're feeding, otters generally remain in one area, but dive down to go collect their food, and then they'll bring it to the surface and eat their food at the surface. In the areas I was working in, they have extreme tides and very strong currents. And so actually, I saw more shifting in their foraging than I have seen in other areas around Alaska. just because of the currents. Interacting is when otters were fighting or playing, mating with each other. And that I actually saw very little of the interacting behavior, so I just decided not to use that in my analysis. And hauling out, which is when otters go onto land. And I did not see any otters in my study areas crawl out onto land. And so these were the behaviors I was looking for. And I was using these behaviors to give me an idea. Was this area being used by males or females with pups? Was it an area that they spent a lot of time foraging, or was it an area that was a little bit more protected? They were coming to rest more. So I was trying to understand how this area was being used. And then the second type of data collection I was doing was the forage data collection. And while my scan samples were done at 6 specific locations in the study area, forage data was collected anywhere in that area that I found sea otters that were eating. So when I would see a sea otter that was eating, for 20 bouts or dives, or one bout, 20 dives, or an hour, I would watch the same sea otter, unless I lost sight of it before then, to see what it was eating. And I would try to determine how old this was. Was it a younger sea otter? Was it an older one? Was it a male, female? Did it have a pup with it? So I was trying to determine information about the sea otter itself. And then I would mark my location and the estimated location of the sea otter using a GPS. And then I was also using a stopwatch to determine how much time they were on the surface of the water eating and how much time they were below the surface feeding, and so diving down. And then when they came up to the top, like onto the surface with their prey, I was trying to identify the prey type down to the species level where possible. And I would try to count how many prey they had and estimate the size of the prey based on the paw width. So the average otter paw width is 52 millimeters wide. And so you can see this chart here on the screen, and I used that chart to help me figure out how large prey were. Some days it was very, very difficult to get very detailed information on the prey type or number or size, because I was dealing with the wind and waves and poor lighting conditions. So I just tried to gather as much data as I possibly could, but it was not always super detailed information that I was gathering. So all of the data I collected then helped inform my understanding of how much time in this area do sea otters spend feeding a day? How many clams are they eating in the clam bed areas? How many, like what size of clams are they often pulling up? And that obviously will change over time. But so I was trying to use all of that data that I collected to help inform otter behaviors and feeding behaviors in that area. And then in conjunction with data collected by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game on razor clam harvests and estimates over the years, and also with sea otter surveys, like aerial surveys and boat surveys that determined how many otters were in the area. I was using all of that data to look back at when the razor clam decline started to happen and say, okay, based on all of this, there's this many sea otters living in this area. This is how many razor clams they would need to eat a day. And so in a year, they would eat this many razor clams. And then compare that of saying, okay, this is how many razor clams the otters would have been eating during that time. Humans were harvesting this many razor clams during that time. Like, where did all of this meet with the decline? And so what I was able to determine and conclude was that during the razor clam decline itself, there was not enough otters in the area to be consuming as many razor clams as humans were harvesting, even with really high estimates for how much the sea otters would have been consuming. So it does not seem likely that the otters were the cause of the decline. It seems very likely that humans were the cause of the decline, harvesting over 1 million clams a year for many years in a row. But what seemed to happen is as the otter population started to increase, humans continued to harvest razor clams at that same level. And so now you have sea otters coming in and also consuming razor clams. And so the combination of humans and sea otters both putting pressure on the razor clams was more than the razor clam population could handle. And so it was not able to repopulate like it naturally should. And so I think the sea otters are now keeping the levels of razor clams lower after that initial decline. And I also suspect that there's a lot of environmental factors that are going on just based on some of the different research that I collected and read about from different scientists who have done other work in the area. But I did not dive into all of those environmental factors, although I do suspect that that is also playing into it. All right, so now that I've given you a brief summary of my journey with studying sea otters, we're going to back up a little bit and talk more generally about sea otters. All right, so let's start with talking about sea otters themselves, because they are quite cool and have some they're very incredible mammals. They are the smallest of our marine mammals, and they can go their entire lives without ever leaving the ocean. They eat, sleep, play, and give birth at sea. In general, you're going to see them belly up like this. And they can actually go haul out on land if they want to, but in some areas they really don't, while in other areas it's common to see them hauled out. And sometimes they'll haul out for protection from predators. One of the researchers I worked with has done a lot of work on studying sea otters out in the Aleutian chain in Alaska. And he was telling me that they have seen when orcas are coming into an area where the sea otters will actually haul out on land to get away from the orcas. So while it's not a super common behavior that they see, it has been noted that sea otters can haul out to get away from predators. Sea otters can stay underwater for more than 5 minutes. Their pups don't sink and they can't dive because they have a very buoyant fur when they're young. It is super cute to watch the pups try to dive down because then they just bounce back to the top. But because of that, they can also float away fairly easily while their mothers are down diving to forage. And so mothers have been known to wrap their babies in kelp so they don't float away. So sea otters have single offspring pregnancies, so population growth is relatively slow. And males live for about 10 to 15 years, and females live for about 15 to 20 years. And one of the cool things I think about sea otters is that they have a little baggy pouch of loose skin under their armpits, and they use them like pockets. And sometimes you'll see them storing food or rocks in there. So I mentioned that I was working in an area that has really strong tides and currents. And sometimes, particularly with the mussels and occasionally with some of the clams, I would see where the sea otters would dive down in a little bit rougher area and stash some of their food when they got to the surface and go to a little bit more protected area to feed. There was an older otter that was particularly how he liked to feed. He would get his food a little further out where it was stronger currents, and then he would kind of go off to the side to eat. And some otters will actually use tools like rocks for opening their prey. And so they might store that little special rock that they use to crack their clams or their urchins open and store that in their little pouch. And then they'll just take that rock and smash their prey on their stomachs. Sea otters are usually less than 5 feet in length and less than 100 pounds. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but the sea otters are divided into northern sea otters and southern sea otters. And the northern sea otters are considered to be larger than the southern ones. And sea otters are found in rocky and soft sediment substrates. They're generally found within a couple kilometers of shore. However, they have also been spotted much farther offshore in some of the aerial surveys and crossing bodies of water that are 60, 80, 100 miles wide. So they can be solitary or in groups. Generally, the females with pups are going to be seen in larger groups than the males are, although you do see males clustered together sometimes. And a group of otters together is called a raft. And generally, when you're seeing those rafts of a couple hundred sea otters, it is primarily going to be females and pups with some juvenile males mixed in. So something that makes sea otters really unique is that they don't have blubber like other marine mammals do. Instead, they have a really dense fur with 1 million hair follicles per square inch. So their hair is so thick that if you go to try to separate their hair, and you can't put your finger down to their skin and like dig your fingers into that. But their fur is very warm, and they need to continue to groom and put air in there to help keep those little air pockets for warmth and buoyancy to help them stay afloat. But their wonderful warm fur is also what led to their downfall. So this is, sea otters once ranged from Mexico all the way to Japan. This is their historic range. But in the 1740s, Russians began exploring this area and encountering sea otters, and they started hunting them for their furs. And by the 1770s and 80s, the Spanish, British, and Americans were all hunting sea otters as well. And then by the early 1800s, the sea otter fur trade was booming. By the end of the 1800s, nearly all of the sea otters were wiped out from their historic range, so trading was no longer profitable. In 1911, the first seal treaty provided protections for the few sea otters that remained. And some of those sea otters that were remaining, people had no idea that they still existed because they had been tucked back into little rocky coves. And so some people thought all of the sea otters were gone, but there were still a few remnant populations left. So by the end of the fur trading days, these were the 13 remnant populations that remained. So now, like at this point, there were very few sea otters remaining in the entirety of their range. But during their absence, when there was large gaps from Mexico to Japan that did not have sea otters, it released the pressure that the sea otters exerted on their prey in those areas. And so during the time that the sea otters were absent from these areas, many prey increased in mean size, density, and biomass. And in some situations, humans created commercial and subsistence fisheries that may have only been possible because sea otters were extirpated from their historical range. And that is what we think happened in eastern Cook Inlet, where I was doing my research. It did not seem that the razor clam populations really exploded until the sea otters were not present. And so when sea otters weren't there, humans could harvest massive amounts of razor clams because there was less pressure on them. So over time, the sea otter population has grown, and that has been a joint result of remnant populations naturally repopulating areas and translocating populations to try to help recover the sea otter populations. And so the remnant populations tend to have a slower growth rate than the translocated populations do. And generally, a population of sea otters is going to build up and reach their carrying capacity. And then as it's reaching that capacity and there's less food availability for the sea otters, generally it's going to be the solitary males that are going to disperse and move into a neighboring habitat. And then they will eventually start getting some females over there as well. And then they will start establishing a population from there. Generally, sea otters don't travel long distances. However, like I mentioned, they have been noted to travel far distances. So today, their range is condensed from what it once was, and it is really fragmented. So if you look at this picture here, you can see that in a little bit in Washington, British Columbia, and then up into Southeast Alaska and on out to Russia, there is a pretty continuous stream of sea otters, although there is a section there in between British Columbia and Southeast Alaska where there are no sea otters. And then along the rest of the Washington and Oregon coast and California coast, there is not many sea otters until you hit down to Central California. And then in Southern California, there is not much happening with sea otters either. So you can see it's a fragmented area. And we have the northern population, which is that Washington north, and then the southern population, which is the California sea otters. And so they have the two different populations, the northern and southern of the sea otters. And so today, sea otter status worldwide is still considered endangered on the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List. And sea otters are protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Organizations like World Wildlife Fund and Alaka Alliance are working to protect sea otters and in some areas reestablish populations of sea otters and aid in their recovery. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about why sea otters are such an important part of our ecosystem and why some of these agencies are really trying to protect the sea otters and help establish their recovery in these areas because they are really vital to our ocean ecosystems. In Alaska, we have 3 stocks of sea otters. We have the southwest stock, the south central stock, and the southeast stock. The southwestern stock is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. However, the south central and southeast stocks are listed as stable. And at one point, it was thought that these stocks are pretty separate from each other. But the more we learn, we're learning that there is a lot of crossover between these stocks. And so it's hard to say some of the otters like kind of have bounced back and forth, or they see genetic evidence that there has been crossover between different stocks. So there's been conversation about, do we leave these as separate stocks, or do we break them down even further into smaller stocks? Do we combine them into a larger grouping of otter stocks? So trying to figure out what the best way is for management purposes is really what the stocks come down to. But in the midst of their recovery, sea otters experienced a major setback in Alaska. On March 24th, 1989, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground in Prince William Sound, Alaska, spilling 11 million gallons of oil. The ecologically sensitive location and the season of the year and the large scale of the spill resulted in one of the largest environmental disasters in U.S. history. I'm sure that many of you remember seeing some of these images as they were on the news, but the spill affected more than 1,300 miles of shoreline, with immense impacts for fish and wildlife in their habitats, as well as for local industries and communities. The oil killed an estimated 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 sea otters, 300 harbor seals, 250 bald eagles, as many as 22 killer whales, and billions of salmon and herring eggs. 25 years post-spill, there was an assessment done, and it said that some species remained in a not recovering or unknown status. And now today, almost 36 years after the spill, impacts are still being seen. And sea otters were hit especially hard after the oil spill. And part of that is because of them not having the blubber, and that their fur is what helps keep them warm and insulated. So when they got oil on their fur, it matted it down, and they weren't able to keep it fluffed for the warmth and buoyancy like they had before the oil spill. And so they weren't able to regulate their temperature like they need to for survival. And they also had some issues with some of them drowning. So they found 871 carcasses in the spill area, but they estimate that far more, about 2,800 or about 40% of their population in that area, actually died due to the oil spill based on sea otter surveys after that point, where the numbers had declined so drastically. So sea otters generally consume between 20 and 25% of their body weight in food a day. They're generalist predators that consume over 150 species of prey, mostly slow-moving benthic invertebrates, such as clams, octopi, crustaceans, sea stars, urchins, worms, snails, chitons, limpets, sand dollars, anemones, sea cucumbers. They have a very large list of what they like to eat. But their diet is really strongly impacted by the habitat type they live in and the time of year it is. So during certain times of year, they're going to consume more prey than other times of year. But generally, they're going to forage in rocky and mixed sediment substrates. They do forage in soft bottom substrates as well. And we're studying more of that now, but a lot of the study has been done on the rocky and mixed sediment substrates. Their forage dives are generally in pretty shallow water, less than 20 meters or so, but they can dive a lot deeper. And their deeper dives often occur when prey become depleted, and they're going to generally forage on the highest quality prey first, and then they're going to decrease their predation efforts on the preferred species and diversify their diets when the density of the preferred prey is reduced. So they're really trying to maximize their caloric input versus their caloric expenditure. So they're going to generally begin with the large, calorically rich, easily captured prey when they move into an area, and then diversify their diets to consume the smaller, more energetically expensive prey when the larger prey becomes limited. Which is, there's been studies on the west side of Eastern Cook Inlet, and the razor clams on that side of the inlet are much larger than the razor clams on the eastern side of the Cook Inlet where I was doing my research. And once upon a time, the clams on the side I was studying on the eastern side used to be larger, but they think because humans and sea otters both like to take the larger clams out of the population, it has changed the median size of the clams of that population. And the western side of the Cook Inlet does not have otters in the clam beds like it does on the eastern side. And people don't go over there and harvest them as much either, although that's starting to change. So it was really in the sea otter's absence, whether it was from the fur trade or then again after the oil spill, where it was really easy to notice because sea otters are consuming so much of their weight a day in food. It was really easy to start seeing what a difference, like how things look different in their absence. And it was really the sea otter absence and recovery that we started to learn how important sea otters are in their ecosystems. So sea otters are known to alter the structure and function of nearshore benthic communities and invertebrate prey that live there. And the role that sea otters play in an ecosystem is really context specific based on what else is in that region. And it varies by habitat and region, but they really help determine the structure of the nearshore communities they live in by regulating the prey abundance, and also generally again are going to be targeting that larger prey. So that's going to change the structure of the community. The reduction in macroinvertebrate size and density is the main driver for that ecosystem change. Sea otters are a keystone species. Sorry, I just realized my little laser is there. But sea otters are a keystone species, and a keystone species is a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend. And if they were removed from that ecosystem, the ecosystem would change drastically. And that is exactly what we saw in the absence of sea otters after the fur trade, after they started to recover in Prince William Sound, but then so many of them were again removed from that population after the oil spill. And so we're going to specifically look at a kelp forest, which sea otters are not just found in kelp forest, they are found in other areas as well. But the kelp forest is an iconic example of their role as a keystone species. So sea urchins consume kelp and can consume an entire forest of kelp. And so if you look at that image on the right-hand side where the sea otters are absent, the urchins have just decimated the kelp beds. But when sea otters are present in a kelp forest, they actually eat sea urchins. And so they help control the sea urchin population, and that helps enhance kelp growth. And you may wonder, why is that so important? Why do we care so much about kelp beds? Well, there's a lot of important parts about kelp beds of helping reduce offshore storms, of helping stabilize ground, but also they're really important because they absorb and store carbon, and healthy kelp beds are going to be a really important part of addressing climate change. So when kelp is present, sea otters can release kelp from the grazing pressures of sea urchins by preying upon the urchins. And then that's going to continue to promote the growth of kelp forest and allows them to remain healthy and provide habitat for fish and other species, so increasing biodiversity. And for example, in the Aleutian Archipelago, sea otters have directly, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. In this Aleutian Archipelago, sea otters have indirectly increased the fish populations that live in the kelp by helping provide more habitat. Kelp helps sequester carbon and fixes the free carbon dioxide molecules, and provides food for coastal ecosystems and provides a calming effect on the hydrodynamics of the ocean that promote the settling of larvae and other materials in the water column and decrease coastal erosion. So many of our invertebrates are in the water column, and their larvae need to settle down to the bottom of the ocean floor to be able to establish, like the clams, lots of the clams and mussels. And so it's really important that we have healthy, intact kelp beds to help protect our ecosystems. So intact ecosystems provide ecosystem services that in turn can provide economic benefits. And so sea otters help to provide ecosystem services such as increased biodiversity, increased resilience to climate change, and the more ecosystem benefits from sea otters, like there may be more benefits from sea otters being present in an ecosystem that we have not even discovered yet. Because if you think about it, it is relatively recent that we have been able to study what has happened in these ecosystems since the recovery of sea otters. And so there's a lot we're still learning. So the top-down predation effects sea otters have on an ecosystem can also help mitigate bottom-up influences, such as anthropogenic nutrient loading in in estuary ecosystems. And places like Elkhorn Slough in California, they've actually seen that with the eelgrass beds there, and how sea otters initiated a trophic cascade and helped reduce some of the algae populations and not be shaded out by the algae. And it is really hard when you're starting to talk about ecosystem services to calculate the costs and benefits of having predators like sea otters in human communities. Because while there's many, many ecosystem benefits of having an intact ecosystem and having your predators there, there is also a cost to humans. And some of that cost has come because of what humans did to sea otters and in the absence of sea otters. But nevertheless, there is still a cost to humans. And we see that in the news. These are some news headlines that show us that as sea otters have moved back into the areas and have been recovering, there have been conflicts with humans. An aggressive sea otter attacks a surfer. Sea otters pose a big threat to Southeast fisheries. Alaskans make a new push to kill more sea otters, saying they're decimating Southeast shellfish. And so even though there's many benefits, humans feel threatened. And so there are strong interactions that at times can cause conflicts between sea otters and shell fisheries. And so in the absence of sea otters, some of the ecosystems became less diverse and productive, with a reduction or loss of primary producers, while in other areas, their absence led to an increase in primary consumer biomass through larger sizes and abundance of invertebrates. And the absence of the sea otters in these ecosystems released the predation pressure they exerted and allowed various prey species to increase their populations to numbers that could sustain commercial and sport fisheries. And people became dependent on those fisheries. And as sea otters repopulate their historical range, they're encroaching on the fisheries established during the years of their absence. And again, that's influencing these conflicts and creating areas of conflict, like boundary lines between sea otters and humans over resources. And subsistence fishermen who rely on shellfish for their food security and commercial fishermen who rely on shellfish for their income do not always consider the sea otter recovery a success story, because as members of coastal communities, they see sea otters as a threat to the shellfish in competition for valuable food sources such as crabs, clams, and sea urchins. But other people consider the sea otter recovery a success story because of the positive effects on the ecosystem through increased biodiversity, climate resiliency, and the local economy through greater ecotourism. But despite the long-term benefits of sea otter recovery into their historic ranges for coastal communities, the recovery of sea otters can threaten local communities in the near term due to cultural and economic loss related to shellfish harvest and can pose a threat to food security. And so as the sea otters have expanded into their historic range and their numbers have grown, there has been a lot of concern, particularly amongst fishermen. And they are posing a real and obvious impact on these fishermen and the local communities in the near term. But again, remembering that there are long-term benefits that far outlast, and trying to help these communities do more ecotourism and look at ways that they can consider sea otters to be an important part of their ecosystems instead of trying to push them out is a really important part of this recovery effort. And then, while the sea otters have experienced incredible success in their recovery, it's really important to continue to monitor and track their health and progress to better understand what is happening with them and also better understand what's happening in our oceans, because as the climate changes, our oceans are changing. And sea otters can give us a lot of information about what is happening in our ecosystems because they are a keystone species. And so here in Alaska, one of the agencies that is doing some of this long-term monitoring is the Gulf Watch Alaska, and I have had an opportunity to work with them in some of their research to understand the ecosystem health of our waters. So this map is an area, again, showing the Kenai Peninsula, but the yellowy, peachy color is where there's some killer whales. The red is the seabird monitoring that they're doing. But the light blue area is all the area that was impacted by the 1989 oil spill. And so Gulf Watch Alaska is the long-term ecosystem monitoring program of the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council for the marine ecosystem affected by the oil spill. And there's recognition that a full recovery is going to take many, many decades, but the long-term monitoring of the spill is important for assessing the recovery of the injured species and for managing the resources and services they provide. And the sea otters are monitored under the nearshore group because they are indicators of our ecosystem health. And so we go out several times a summer into these different areas and monitor the sea otters. What are they eating? How many are there? They're trying to understand the sea otter health in those areas because that gives an indicator to the whole ecosystem health. And the nearshore marine ecosystems face really significant challenges at global and regional scales, with threats arising from both the adjacent lands and oceans. And so the nearshore group is really trying to tease apart the human threats from the naturally induced causes and describe the patterns of change that they're seeing. So as we've gone from understanding the history of sea otters, of how they were present from Mexico the whole way up to Japan, to now really where their populations are limited and fragmented after their recovery, it's important to continue monitoring their health to really understand our ecosystems and have healthy ecosystems. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and understand how sea otters are such an important part of our marine ecosystems and how they may help us better understand our changing oceans. Thank you for joining me. And Brooke, if there's questions, please send them my way.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura. That was fantastic. I feel so much more knowledgeable on sea otters. This is wonderful. We do have lots and lots of questions, and so everyone, we'll see how many we can get through. But in your control panel, there is a questions box there. Go ahead and put them in, and we'll see how many we can get through. So I have a theme coming up. A lot of people are asking about predators. Could you elaborate a little bit further? What are some of sea otters' predators?
So really, sea otters, they do have predators, but there is not generally a lot of predation on sea otters. Killer whales will occasionally eat them. Generally, they mostly just kill them. And part of that is a training tool for teaching their young. So killer whales are definitely one of their predators. In the last couple years, I can't remember what year it was, but it was just a few years ago, there was an article about how wolves are actually predating on sea otters as well, mostly when they haul out on shore. They've also found that bears can predate on sea otters as well. Again, generally when they're hauled out on land. Although you do have some of these like areas where you have bears and wolves coming up to the shoreline, and otters there at the shoreline too. So it's not always that they're hauled out, but they might just be in shallow water as well. But generally, when people think of predators, it's going to be the orca, but not even so much to eat them because there's not much fat on them. They're mostly just a big fur ball. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks for that. Next here, could you elaborate why females live longer than males?
So the males can be a little bit aggressive. People think about sea otters being these nice, cute, cuddly animals, but really, I like to remind people they're the largest member of the weasel family, and they're not actually very nice. So the males do fight. Males are sometimes aggressive towards females during mating, but it's generally the life expectancy of the males is a little bit lower because they tend to be a little bit more aggressive out there. They're also going to be the ones who go and explore new territories when the populations are starting to expand, and they're often more solitary, whereas the females can cluster together for protection. A lot of times the males are going to be a little bit more solitary and maybe get separated from the others, and their threats are greater when they're solitary than when they're in a group, and the males are often more solitary.
Yes, that makes total sense. Just exposure, that makes sense. So we also have lots of questions about their tails. Do they have any special uses for their tails, or what do they use them for?
Honestly, I've not actually read very much about their tails in all the hundreds of articles I was reading. Um, there was very little mention of their tail. I think partially for stability as they're swimming and like floating for resting, but I think that's their main part. Now, my understanding is like river otters, they use their tails more, but for the sea otters, there's very little in any of the readings that I've ever done that talk about their tails.
Oh, and actually, you just lobbed up the perfect next question. We have lots of questions here asking about the differences between sea otters and all the other species of otters, whether it be like giant otters or river otters. So, how are they different, and maybe how are they similar?
Honestly, I have not done a deep dive into most of the other kind of otters, um, just because that was not my focus area. And I was literally reading hundreds and hundreds of research papers on sea otters and really trying to focus in specifically on them. But in part, their physiology is somewhat different because while river otters can go into the ocean, they're predominantly going to be living near fresh water, which is true of pretty much all of the other otters, is that they are freshwater species. So what they're going to be eating is going to be slightly different than what the sea otters are eating. And their physiology is different as well. Like with the sea otters living in the ocean and just needing that dense of fur because they don't have blubber, whereas the other otters are far more between land and water. Whereas the sea otters, like I said, can literally live in the ocean their entire lives. Um, so whereas other otters, it's more of a combination. I'm sure that there's lots more differences than that, but those are some of the basic ones that I can think of off the top of my head right now.
Great, thank you. Next, this is a very, very good question. With these low population numbers and them being separated, are scientists worried about the genetics of these isolated populations of otters?
So there has been some concern of that. But one of the things that, like I briefly mentioned, is that, like in Alaska, with the different stocks of populations, like of otters, they're realizing that there's been a lot more crossover than they ever thought. So my understanding is that there had been greater concern about their genetics, needing like a bottlenecking, basically, that there wasn't enough genetic diversity with some of these groups. But as they've done more DNA testing and are realizing that there's been more crossover than they realized, my understanding is there's a little bit less concern of that now. However, not like the populations down in British Columbia and Washington and California, I am not quite as familiar with the genetics of those populations. And those are a little bit more isolated than the ones here in Alaska are. So it may be different with some of those populations. And I do know that that has been part like of some of their translocations of trying to help introduce different genes to areas as well.
Right, that makes sense. Thanks for that. Next, are there any environmental factors that are big on causing the decline on sea otters, like climate change or El Nino or La Nina events, anything like that?
So I think, like many things when we're talking about the environment and ecosystems, there's a lot of complexity. One of the things has been, like, again, I'm speaking specifically more towards the Alaska oceans because that is what I've done far more research on and have a much better understanding of, is like we have had some ocean warming events here that have played massive roles in wiping out large numbers of seabirds and different fish and invertebrates. And some of that is like wiping out prey sources for sea otters. And so that has had an impact in some areas, which they think has been a contribution to that southwest stock in Alaska, where they do think some of the environmental factors from some of the storms have caused that. With climate change, we're seeing larger ocean storms, some erosion, and some changing of currents. And so that has had an impact on sea otters. And that might not be having a direct impact on like causing them to lose their life, but it changes their patterns and their food sources and where they can be. And also, I just lost my train of thought with that. But yes, they are seeing impacts of climate change and environmental factors that are impacting sea otters. Even if it's not a direct, this happened, otters died, but this happened, otter food sources are being impacted, so otter numbers are changing. And as we're having more ice pack in some areas, less in some areas in the winter, and so that's also impacting where they are spending their winters as well.
Gotcha. And I think since we've reached the top of the hour, the last question that I would like to ask you is, can we see sea otters on any of Nat Half's trips up to Alaska? And if so, what would be some of them that maybe we should have our eye out for if we're interested in that?
Yeah, absolutely. The ultimate Alaska adventure goes to Kenai Fjords National Park, and that is part of the South Central stock. And there are sea otters there. Um, it there's the numbers are okay there. There's not huge populations, but generally you get to see some otters on that trip. And then the grizzly ship goes to Kodiak and then on out to the Katmai coast. And there are sea otters in Kodiak and also along the Katmai coast. But really in Kodiak, there is an older sea otter that likes to hang out at the docks. So if you walk the docks, you might actually go get to see Oscar. And then in Homer, there is a very healthy population of sea otters in Kachemak Bay. And so the Alaska bear camp trips go to Homer and then head out to bear camp. And so if you walk along the spit in Homer and along the docks in Homer, you often see many sea otters in that area as well. Very, very rarely are they ever spotted at bear camp just because the otter population does not really go up into Chinitna Bay very much. Occasionally they've been sighted, but not very often. So definitely keep an eye out on our Alaska trips because you can see them on all of those ones.
And just talk about a bonus, right? To
Yes,
see some,
exactly.
how incredible. Well, wonderful, Laura. I would love to turn it to you for any last closing comments today.
I just want to say thank you all for joining me. And I hope that this has inspired you all to think about how it's easy to think about our ecosystems and be like, oh, we need to save this animal, but not always understanding what role they play in our ecosystem, that they really are a vital part of helping keep our world a healthy place. So thank
Yes.
you all.
And thank you, Laura, for taking the time to share all of your knowledge with us. And congrats again on getting your master's. Is such a big accomplishment. And I would like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. And keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement. We did record today's presentation and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.